Thank you, everybody who's showing up today after, I know, a very long, intense first day of classes. Scholarly editing, as Michael, I think, has just described, has been my main research focus for the past 15 years, and it looks like it will continue to be my main focus for the foreseeable future. I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have had these opportunities to edit Swift and Pope, and I find editing to be one of the most valuable and satisfying activities that a scholar can do. Scholarly editing is not for everyone, but thorough and reliable scholarly editions have much to offer a wide range of users, and not only academics and students. I say this because I view scholarly editions as projects that collect, synthesize, and communicate a range of knowledge directly relevant to the material being edited. I have this capacious view of scholarly editing because of the authors that I've been working on, Swift and Pope, shown here in famous busts by the French sculptor Roubilliac. Both of them wrote in a range of genres that touched on so many cultural, artistic, political, economic, philosophical, and religious concerns of their periods. Scholarly editions should serve the interests and needs of those users wanting to learn about such intersecting concerns. Scholarly editions, in order for them to have value in the present and in the future, must also be grounded in a thorough textual understanding of the works being edited. A scholarly edition should, whenever possible, clarify how a particular work came to be and how it changed over time, whether through authorial revision or some other kind of intervention. Careful attention to bibliographical matters is therefore most important, as they help us understand the significance of the physical forms that the works embodied, and can sometimes allow us to discover how and why a work changed as it was transformed from a manuscript to a printed book to yet another printed book. Much of what I've said seems to portray scholarly editing as a solitary endeavor, but of course, such editions are the products of multiple communities with diverse interests and expertise. One of the many pleasures I've encountered while working on these editions is discovering past and present biblionetworks that make these editions possible. The primary documents that I've had the good fortune of examining have survived only because of industrious collectors who recognize their value and preserve them for posterity, both for personal reasons as well as a sense of cultural stewardship. Librarians and archivists have been essential for my work, and they have many times helped me discover documents that have been in their collections for years. They have also guided me in understanding the historical transmission of such documents, a process that also involves collectors and booksellers. This is one of the many great things about Rare Book School, the way that it brings together a wide range of people from various bookish endeavors to meet and learn from each other. The process of assembling a scholarly edition might be seen as a microcosm of the broad world that Rare Book School represents. Much of the literature on scholarly editing focuses on textual matters, and rightly so, because the textual situations of many verbal works can be quite complex, and they therefore demand rigorous attention to matters of paleography, bibliography, textual transmission, publishing history, and so on. There is also a smaller, though substantial, body of writing on annotation, how one should comment on matters of context and interpretation. There's also a wealth of models for an editor to draw upon, namely annotations and other editions. And these transmit a shared understanding, as well as differences of opinion, that together guide an editor in annotating a work. But one area that has received far less attention in the literature on scholarly editing concerns attribution, which is my focus for today. By attribution, I mean determining which works an author wrote, or where there is some doubt, as there often is, what an author probably wrote, or possibly wrote, or probably did not write. This is, of course, an important practical concern, because if one's aim is to edit the complete works of an author, then one has to decide which works are to be treated as by that author. And my interest in attribution grows directly out of my work on the Swift and Pope editions. When I began working on the Swift edition, I did not have a theory or a well-articulated method for determining which poems Swift did or did not write. But over time, I developed something that might approximate such a method, and it was greatly needed, as my collaborator James Woolley and I ultimately identified 424 poems that have been attributed to Swift, but that we believe that he did not, or probably did not, write. That there are so many unpersuasive attributions says much about Swift's popularity and notoriety, his penchant for secrecy, and his preferences for anonymity and pseudonymity. A distinction is often made between internal evidence and external evidence. Internal evidence includes stylistic aspects of the work itself. These might include vocabulary, metrical patterns, or parallels in wording and/or ideas that are similar to other writings known to be by the same author. This internal evidence could be assessed in a quantitative or statistical manner, but it doesn't have to be. In my experience researching the history of 424 poems attributed to Swift on unconvincing grounds, and in my ongoing work on the 160 or so poems unconvincingly attributed to Pope, I have found that there was often an over-reliance and even abuse of this internal evidence. For example, some of the alleged patterns, parallels or patterns, turned out on closer examination to be not especially distinctive. Many poems could be identified as belonging to a specific genre. And the nature of genre is that certain conventions tend to be followed, and those conventions can have as great, if not a greater, factor in determining stylistic traits. Also, the search for parallels has changed greatly because of the availability of large textual databases that often reveal that a particular phrase or expression was used quite often and therefore could not serve in any way as a reliable marker of an individual author. None of this is to say that internal evidence has no value, just that its value is sometimes more limited than what its advocates suggest. I also learned while doing this work that too often the external evidence has not been considered enough, or it hasn't been sought out, or it has been misunderstood. Relying on external evidence is difficult and unpredictable because in the first place, one has to find such evidence, assuming that it once existed and still does. By external evidence, I refer to evidence outside the content of the work itself. This could include manuscript evidence, including identification of handwriting, the history of attribution, including alternate claims of authorship, letters and diaries, book trade and copyright evidence, newspaper advertisements or other published information, and the bibliographical evidence in the printed books themselves. One of my main interests at present is encouraging those working on attribution to focus more directly on external evidence and to show how an analysis of that evidence can sometimes help us better understand whether an author wrote a particular work or not. To show how these principles work in practice, I want to examine a poem that has been attributed to Alexander Pope. And I will walk through my process for assessing and ultimately rejecting this attribution. In doing so, I hope to model for you the kind of thinking that scholarly editors engage in when dealing with the challenges of attribution. As you'll see, I draw mainly from external evidence, and that evidence will range widely, including bibliographical evidence, which seems fitting for this audience. The poem is quite short, and I'll read it in its entirety. Upon a girl of 7 years old. Wit's queen, if what the poets sing be true, and beauty's goddess, childhood never knew. Pallas, they say, sprung from the head of Jove, full grown, and from the sea, the queen of love. But had they miss your wit and beauty seen, Venus and Pallas both had children been. They, from the sweetness of that radiant look, a copy of young Venus might have took. And from those pretty things you speak, have told how Pallas talked when she was 7 years old. The poem begins by referencing ancient Roman mythology, specifically the goddesses Pallas Athena and Venus, the goddesses of wit and love, respectively. According to the ancient poets, both goddesses originated in their full adult forms. But, the poem alleges, had those poets encountered this 7-year-old girl who was the subject of the poem, they would have modeled those goddesses on her. Now, as you can tell right away, there is not much evidence in the poem that we have to work with. It is only 10 lines. The mythological references are widely known. There is no especially distinctive diction that's being employed, and there's no indication or even any hint as to this young girl's identity. We don't know who she was, who her parents were, or what relationship she had to the author of this poem. If we are able to gain some insight as to who did or did not write this poem, we will have to rely on whatever external evidence we can assemble. It's best to start with the poem's first printing, which was in a collection entitled Miscellaneous Poems and Translations by Several Hands, the 2nd edition. I'll return to this volume later, but for now I will note that although this title page highlights 9 poems in the center assigned to Pope, the poem on a 7-year-old girl is not listed among them. So when first printed, this poem was anonymous. And the poem stayed anonymous for nearly 2 centuries. And it was not reprinted for over 200 years. In many respects, it vanished from everyone's attention. The first time it was assigned to anyone was in 1910 in a catalog of Marshall Lefferts's Pope collection. No explanation was given for the attribution, which was then repeated by R.H. Griffith in his 1922 bibliography of Pope, where again no explanation was given. The first time anyone offered an argument about this poem's authorship was in 1954 in Volume 6 of the Twickenham edition of the Poems of Alexander Pope. There, the editor Norman Alt made an argument for Pope's authorship, which he acknowledged was perhaps not overwhelming. And I'm not aware of any further comment on this attribution until 2019, when Julian Ferraro and Paul Baines, the editors of Volume 1 of the Longman edition of Pope's poems, discussed this poem in a single paragraph. They concluded that there was an absence of firm evidence for Pope's authorship, and on that basis did not include the poem in their edition. As you'll see, I agree with their conclusion, but I think there's more that needs to be said. Before assessing Alt's argument for Pope's authorship, let's return to the poem's first printing, which for our purposes is the only printing that matters. In many respects, this is an unusual case where the only thing to go on concerning this attribution is a single text. Now, the scholarly editor wants to know everything that can be known about this printing. Who was responsible for it? What were the original circumstances of its publication? Is there any evidence that Pope was directly or indirectly involved with it? Are there any other clues in this volume or elsewhere that would help us? I'll start with the most basic information. The title page states that this is the second edition. Now, it's important to remember that publishers are not bibliographers. By that I mean that publishers are not obligated to follow the modern definition of edition that bibliographers use. From a bibliographical perspective, this volume is, for the most part, a reissue of an edition from 1712. That is, this volume, for the most part, reuses pages originally set in type and issued with a 1712 title page. And there are other important differences. A comparison of the two title pages is instructive. The title page from the original 1712 issue is on the left, and the one from the reissue is on the right. The original issue presents the volume as a miscellany where no author is singled out. All the contributors are subsumed under the category of several hands. You could not infer from the original title page that this volume contained the first printing of one of Pope's most enduringly famous poems, namely The Rape of the Lock, in its original two-canto version. In contrast, the reissue highlights particularly the contributions of Pope, listing the 9 poems I noted earlier. The last 3 of these 9 poems are the previously published An Ode for Music on St. Cecilia's Day, Windsor Forest, and an essay on criticism. None of these 3 poems had appeared in the original 1712 issue. The effect of adding these poems, along with the other changes to the title page, reinforces how much the 1714 reissue is being marketed as a collection of Pope's work. That shift in marketing is also evident in the early advertisements for each issue of this miscellany. The advertisement at the top is for the original 1712 issue, and it doesn't name any author, and it doesn't list any poem. The advertisement at the bottom is from December 1713 for the 1714 reissue, and it lists 8 poems, noting that all written by Mr. Pope. Another important difference in the title pages concerns the imprint, the text on the bottom of the title page that indicates who produced the volume and who claimed ownership of its contents, that is, the right to the copy, which we know as copyright. The volume's publisher for the original 1712 issue and the 1714 reissue was Bernard Lintott. The 1714 reissue adds the name of William Lewis because Lewis owned the copyright for Pope's essay on criticism. And in order for Lintott to republish an essay on criticism, he had to work out an agreement with Lewis, and that included placing his name on the title page. Lintott not only added the 3 poems and created a new title page, he also added a new half title to the volume. That addition wasn't necessary, but it allowed him to include an updated list of his publications on the verso of this leaf, which gave him another opportunity to advertise his publications. Also, to highlight the 3 added poems by Pope, Lintot included a part title for each poem. These part titles highlight the importance of these poems for this reissue of the Miscellany. When the poem Windsor Forest was reprinted for the 1714 reissue, some error must have occurred because a leaf was canceled and replaced with a corrected leaf. By canceled, I mean that after this leaf was printed, but before the book was sold, it was cut out, and in some copies, as you can see here in the center photo, this is the very sort of gutter of the volume, there is a stub. That is all that is remaining of the canceled leaf. There was also an errata leaf printed for the 1714 reissue, but this errata leaf is not found in many copies, and I have not seen it myself, so I don't have a photo of that for you. There was one other leaf printed for the 1714 reissue, and this one contains, on one side, it's Recto, the poem on the 7-year-old girl, and on the other side, it's Verso, an even shorter poem, and one with quite different content. So I'll read this one for you too. Epigram upon 2 or 3. 2 or 3 visits. 2 or 3 bows. 2 or 3 civil things. 2 or 3 vows. 2 or 3 kisses. 2 or 3 sighs. 2 or 3 Jesuses and let me dies. 2 or 3 squeezes. 2 or 3 towses. With 2 or 300 pounds lost at their houses, can never fail cuckolding 2 or 3 spouses. Pope was certainly involved in selecting poems for this miscellany, including his own and some of others. And we have a statement from Joseph Addison in the periodical The Spectator about the late miscellany published by Mr. Pope. And in 18th century usage, published meant what we would mean by edited. However, as James McClaverty has noted, Lintot's record of payments to Pope for his contributions to this miscellany, the detailed list, this record does not mention or even hint at editorial duties. And this record does not mention the 2 short poems that I've read to you, and it's possible that Lintot didn't even know who wrote the poems. So there is no basis for Alt's first claim. His second claim is that Pope was responsible for including the 5 poems added to the 1714 reissue of this miscellany, namely the 3 poems attributed to Pope, an ode for music, Windsor Forest, and an essay on criticism, as well as the poem on the 7-year-old girl and the epigram upon 2 or 3. But this claim ignores something important to the 18th century book trade and really to publishing practices generally. The issue is ownership. In 1714, Pope did not own an ode for music, Windsor Forest, or an essay on criticism. Lintot owned the first 2 poems, and William Lewis owned the other. Therefore, Lintot and Lewis could decide when, where, and how to reprint these poems. Pope might offer his input, but it was not his decision to make. There's another piece of evidence against the claim that Pope, rather than Lintot, was the guiding force behind the decision to add more poems to this miscellany. As we know from many studies, as well as from surviving manuscripts and printed books, Pope was a restless reviser of his own work. And any new printing of a poem offered him an almost irresistible opportunity to tinker with it. Yet there are no revisions to the texts of these 3 previously published poems. The lack of revisions does not prove that Pope had no involvement, but it does cast additional doubt. Alt's third claim concerns the leaf with the two added short poems. Alt argues that because Pope was the author of the poem on the verso of this leaf, the epigram upon 2 or 3, then he is the likely author of the poem on the recto, the one on the 7-year-old girl. There's, of course, no logical necessity why the author of one of these poems has to be the author of the other. And Alt's third claim is weakened by the fact that the text of the epigram upon 2 or 3 is faulty. Lines 1, 3, and 5 have 9 syllables instead of 10. These lines are missing the conjunctions and or with that appear in texts that we know Pope authorized. Furthermore, the printing of this epigram exhibits a typographical monotony not evident in the authorized printings. Every instance of 2 and 3 is italicized. Pope was, to say the least, fussy about such matters, and it is difficult to believe that he would have approved this text of his epigram. Now, so far, I feel as if I've been acting like a defense attorney who seeks to rebut the prosecution's case but refuses to offer an alternative theory. So here's my alternative theory for your consideration, and it centers around the publisher rather than the poet. Bernard Lintot, more than a year after publishing his Miscellany in 1712, faced a problem in that this Miscellany did not sell as well as he had hoped. Because Lintot had many unsold copies, he decided to resell them by capitalizing on Pope's fame as a poet, which had increased since 1712. Lintot expanded the Miscellany to include more work by Pope, and with justification, he marketed the expanded volume, the 1714 reissue, as a Pope collection. When he did that, he needed a new title page, and he also included other leaves that we saw earlier, a new half title with an advertisement on the verso, the 3 part titles, a cancel leaf, an errata leaf, which I can't show you, and the leaf with the 2 short poems. At this point, it's worth noting that the bibliographical format for this Miscellany is octavo, which means that a single sheet of paper resulted in 8 leaves, hence octavo for 8. Now, we've all heard that nature abhors a vacuum. Well, printers and publishers in this period abhorred wasting paper. So if 7 leaves of an octavo sheet were needed, why not find a reason to print something on the 8th leaf? And this is what I think Lintot did with no involvement or input from Pope. He had 1 leaf that could be filled with 2 very short poems. We know that this leaf was set in type after Lintot had decided to include Windsor Forest because the verso of this leaf has the catchword wind with a hyphen there at the bottom right, meaning it leads into Windsor Forest. Pope's epigram upon 2 or 3 had been circulating in manuscript, but without necessarily identifying Pope as its author. Lintot acquired the poem, somehow, as well as a poem upon an unnamed 7-year-old girl. There is no reason to posit and little basis to support Pope's involvement with the edition of either poem. And there is therefore little reason to think that Pope wrote the poem upon a 7-year-old girl. Lintot probably didn't think that Pope wrote it because he never reprinted the poem. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Pope had no role in this matter. Here it's important to examine the books themselves and, whenever possible, multiple copies. David Foxon has noted that he had never seen 2 identical copies of the 1714 reissue of this Miscellany. And some copies lack this leaf with the 2 short poems. For one copy I have examined, one can see that this leaf was in fact canceled as shown by this stub, which maybe you can just make out in the gutter. I continue to examine as many copies as I can, and in fact today I examined a copy here at UVA that does have this leaf. I can't yet say what percentage of surviving copies has the leaf, but there appear to be enough that raise the possibility that someone, perhaps Pope, wanted to cancel it. One can imagine a good reason for Pope wanting to do this. I think he would have been unhappy to have his poem on cuckolding immediately precede his major poem, Windsor Forest, which is, among other things, a serious celebration of the treaty that ended the War of the Spanish Succession. It's also notable that Lintet's third and fourth editions of this miscellany do not include the epigram upon 2 or 3, as if he were respecting Pope's veto. But the fifth edition, from 1726, does have this epigram, though by then there was a serious rift between Pope and Lintet. So where does all of this leave us? I do not think that in the end we are in a position to state with certainty that Pope did not write the poem on a 7-year-old girl. But certainty is often not achieved in humanistic inquiry. We are instead in the area of probability, or more precisely, relative claims of plausibility. It seems to me that there is a perfectly plausible scenario for how this poem came to be included in the 1714 reissue of Lintet's Miscellany, a scenario that is consistent with the available documentary evidence and with what we know about printing and publishing practices of the time. The poem was most likely a late arrival and an afterthought, printed to fill one page that would otherwise have been wasted. Part of the larger lesson here that extends beyond Pope is to understand the relationships among a short poem on a page, to the sheet that contains it, to the publication that it is part of, to the publisher who issued it. Under the scenario sketched here, there is no need for Pope's involvement at all, and there is in fact no evidence that would point to his involvement with the poem's inclusion. And therefore there is little to no reason to think that he was the author of this poem, a poem that, to reiterate, was not reprinted until 1954. In sum, the external evidence drawn from the books themselves, book trade records, advertisements, and the literary habits of an author help us evaluate a particular argument for an attribution. In my view, this evidence and the related analysis shows that the argument for Pope's authorship of this poem is not persuasive. My experience with examining hundreds of attributions is that such a focus on external evidence rather than internal evidence, while no magic solution, is the preferred way to approach challenging issues of attribution, and is therefore the better way to ensure that scholarly editions do their utmost to clarify what an author did or did not write. Thank you for listening.